And hello, everyone, dear colleagues, guests, and CETRA Summer School participants. So I will be talking today about field research. And let me first tell you what I mean with field research. In my today's talk, I will concentrate on field work or field observations that are characterized by the fact that the translators, interpreters, or other translation and interpreting relevant actors are observed while they act. So this observation is carried out in the field, in this so-called real world, or some call it authentic, others call it the natural environment, whatever you prefer. So also, this kind of qualitative field observation is sometimes also referred to as direct observation. So it's a specific type of observational research where the data is collected in the field, in the natural situations of the participants and their activities. So it's rather than experiments that are organized by researchers in controlled research settings, or in classrooms, in laboratories, and so on. So in the case of translation and interpreting, this can mean spending extended periods of time with translators in their offices or at homes if they work from home, or shadowing interpreters in their booth in courtrooms, hospitals, other workplaces where interpreters might work. Or also, of course, in translation and interpreting didactic and pedagogical studies, you would follow translation and interpreting teachers and learners in institutional and in maybe also informal learning and teaching situations. And rather than concentrating on the concepts and history of field research in translation and interpreting studies, I would like to offer insights into the practical challenges and options of planning and carrying out field research on translation. I will try to discuss the steps to be taken in the different phases of such research projects, from the development of the project idea, choice of research design, role of theoretical foundations, which might be different in different projects. Then, of course, acquisition of data, communication on the research in publications and otherwise. So, and of course, I will use examples of the current research in my research group, SOCO-Trans, Socio-Cognitive Translation Studies, here at the University of Vienna Center for Translation Studies. And I will very much concentrate today on these first steps, because I will, in my fifth lecture, I will report on the results of some of our recent field research projects on translation expertise. And also, I will then only talk about qualitative data analysis. I think it's a topic that really needs to be taken up, especially in its give it its own space. So that will follow in the fifth lecture. And I will not include the topic of data analysis and interpretation in this lecture. So theoretically, it's simple. You start with an idea, problem, or question. You check the current state of research to be able to conceptualize the topic, and then conduct an empirical investigation. But the problems, of course, start with choosing the idea or problem or question. What are relevant questions for translation and interpreting field research? For me, the bottom line regarding the choice of research, the research question is anything that brings new insights or can help to question or further develop mainstream knowledge is relevant. But how do you find a relevant research question for field research? Translation field research would ideally address questions regarding the whole complexity of translation. So including the processes, products, contexts, constructs, persons involved. So different questions will be relevant depending on the focus of the research orientation. And this is why I think there is potentially an infinite number of relevant questions that field research can address. Even more radically, for example, in grounded theory oriented research, you would not start with an exactly defined research question and hypothesis, but rather with a topic, a field, and then develop the main questions and concerns together with the participants, so that these questions reflect the concerns relevant for the setting and for the participants. So this means that the relevant questions in that kind of research also depend on the setting, that is the situation of activity that you study. Grounded theory research has great potential in basic fundamental research. A similar orientation towards participant engagement can also be found in more applied transformational research. That is the case in collaborative and participatory research, because here the research is carried out on participants, for participants, with and by participants. So the participants might contribute to deciding whether we are asking the right questions in the first place, and then also they might be involved in the data acquisition and later on in the research project. Personally, when I evaluate my research against quality criteria for qualitative field research, I use criteria like these ones. Actuality, I want my research to respond to current topics and research deficits in the international research scene, or to anticipate and critically reflect on new developments in the field of practice, maybe. Then innovation, the idea is to develop new ideas or methods, but of course, to know whether there is anything new in my ideas, I need to know the current state of research. So we should not introduce new labels, terms, and models, or launch new schools if there is already some related tradition or activity that you can relate to. Then interdisciplinarity. Many questions and problems need an interdisciplinary approach, because problems and solutions do not respect disciplinary borders. And then there's the big challenge that you will need to know the current state of research in this other discipline too, to a certain extent, at least for your research questions. And internationality, contributing to the development of the international translation studies community in some way. These criteria are, of course, not specific for field research. What's specific for qualitative field observation? Since they take place in the participants' natural environment, they offer high levels of authenticity, or that's the goal, that they would offer high levels of authenticity and data contextualization. So the data are obtained in a specific context, in real time, in real life settings, as the events unfold. And the observations are supposed to offer a detailed understanding of a case in its context and history. And they allow researchers to try to explain, for example, or approximate, for example, why people act the way they do, why certain decisions are made, why translations are the way they are. Being present and observing also means we become empirically aware of relevant new factors, which can then lead to the development of hypotheses and further studies. Also, extended periods of field observation provide insights into changes in behavior, changes or in technology, habits, ways of working, resources, and so on. For a research project or funding application to succeed, I recommend concentrating on your favorite topic if somehow possible. something that you are passionate about, because I'm convinced that you can only receive funding for an excellent research proposal, and you can only write an excellent research proposal if you are passionate about your research idea. So if somehow possible, I know it's not always possible for in working frameworks and contexts, but try to first develop your own idea and only then go looking for how to realize and fund your research project in your research environment. For funding applications, you will need to prove in your research application that you already know the topic well. For example, by having written publications or given talks on the topic. And I can report on a personal learning here. I wrote my first funding application for the Austrian Science Fund, FWF, in the area of human-computer interaction directly. And it was rejected due to my short publication list in the area of human-computer interaction. The main feedback of the evaluators, the reviewers, was between the lines, why should we finance you getting to know human-computer interaction? So kind of, as they say, I fell down, I got up, I adjusted my crown, and I carried on. So my further applications since then have been in the field of translation studies, and they have been approved. So never give up, always try again. Use the reviews in a positive way to work further on your application. Also, depending on your research question, you will need to decide on your research approach. Field research can be either basic or applied research. And basic research is primarily concerned with describing and analyzing translation and interpreting relevant phenomena, while applied research aims at raising awareness or developing research-based solutions to problematic phenomena. For me, there's a certain order or sequence here too. First, you or someone else must investigate the phenomena in question so that you have enough knowledge and understanding around the topic. That's the role of basic research. If that has not been done and you rush to conduct applied research, your research might not have a sufficient foundation. For applied research, you must have something to apply. Otherwise, you cannot explain why you evaluate or develop, optimize or design something in a certain way in applied research projects. There's no basic research insights to apply. And this is what I mean when I say that basic foundational research is primary kind of research and applied research is a secondary kind of research. It's not a value statement, it's a statement of order or sequence. Field research on translation and interpreting can be basic or applied or both, but it's always empirical, or rather it's always both theoretical and empirical. Theoretical research is based on conceptual analysis on the basis of existing research literature, and empirical research systematically gathers and interprets information beyond the research review. And that's, of course, what is done in field research too. So to weave your research to the discourse of the translation studies research community and to avoid reinventing the wheel, you need to carry out conceptual analysis on the basis of existing research literature before heading out into the field. I think, that's my personal opinion, even if your aim is to describe phenomena inductively and data-based, bottom-up, or from the participant's perspective, I think it makes sense to do your own literature research first. Otherwise, you cannot really explain why you choose to study certain settings and certain phenomena in the first place. And also you see much more in the setting if you have dealt with the scholarly discourse first, because you know what kind of phenomena might appear. Of course, They are only hypotheses, and you should look at that critically and write down your own expectations so that you're aware of them and you're able to criticize them and falsify them. But still, I think that's a good idea. So after having found your favorite topic and developed an idea of what you want to investigate, you will need to motivate it in the context of current research. For example, in your research plan and your PhD thesis, but also in applications and publications. Here you need to explain how your research responds to current topics and research deficits in the international research scene, or to new developments in the field of practice. I will give you some examples from my research group. An obvious motivation for field studies is the fact that many topics in translation studies have been investigated either on a theoretical level, but not empirically, or they have been studied by analyzing products, source and target text, maybe paratext, by observations in the lab maybe, and also through questionnaires and interviews only. So this is our motivation for our current research project, Rethinking Translation Expertise, RETREX. Here, our aim is to put expertise in its lived context and shed light on the corresponding socio-cognitive and interactional dynamics. So studying expertise in the field can give insights into these research questions or aspects like construction. What does actually expertise or competence or professionalism mean for the social actors that we observe and talk to? Also practice, who is considered an expert or a professional and why? How do translators navigate through their tasks, and how do they interact with other people and tools? Also, the function of expertise, which interests lie behind the expertise discourse, and contradictions and conflicts, maybe between people and actors, but also what are the differences between what people do and what they say they do. The second typical way of motivating your research question is finding an explicit reference to a research deficit in the scholarly literature. For example, Daniela Schlager, my colleague Daniela Schlager's dissertation project had this kind of eureka moment when she read this quote by Andrew Chesterman. We have become accustomed to the term scopus to denote the intended effect of a translation. We might also make use of the companion term telos to denote the personal motivation of translators. The reasons why they work in this field in general, and also the reasons why they translate a given text. So ever since Dani read this passage, she has been reflecting on all the dimensions of this idea and all the concepts that scopus and telos might be related to. And as a third example, I would like to show how the research question can be motivated by new developments in the field of practice. Regina Rogel, again, my colleague here, postdoc researcher, is interested in tackling questions that interweave non-professional translation and technology use. For example, she has studied volunteer translator networks and language technologies in disaster aid in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. And in her PhD project that she successfully defended this year, she set out to study amateur online translation platforms, and she concentrated on the interplay between material structures and social processes. And she motivated this research with the rapid technological changes in the practice of translation and the fact that non-professional translation has received so much less attention than professional translation in translation studies. Okay, so let us now assume that you have found one or several interesting and inspiring research questions for your PhD or research project the next steps in line will be the literature review, and based on the literature review, maybe developing research theses or hypotheses. However, it's typical of qualitative field research that the research concepts are defined and refined in the process of research, as Flick describes it. The factors to be studied are not fully predetermined and defined prior to the empirical inquiry. Instead, this empirical inquiry aims to detect factors, new factors that are relevant for understanding the activities and the participants or the groups under study. The factors are described and defined bottom up based on the data in that grounded manner. And only then you reflect upon them and consider the current state of research again and your theoretical conceptualizations. This kind of qualitative field research also has a specific stance regarding the use of hypotheses. Their use is either rejected altogether, since they would require clear-cut definitions prior to data acquisition, and you might not want that because you want to work data-based, bottom-up, or tentative initial working theses are defined with the help of prior research, or maybe with the help of a pilot study or a first case study, and then those initial working theses are refined as the data analysis and the insights grow through this joint collection, coding, and analysis of data. And Glaser and Strauss talk here of theory as process. So in the research process, data collection and analysis cannot and shouldn't always be separated in this kind of research. Rather, the analysis starts with the very first data that is gathered. You already started reflecting, interpreting it, and Gibbs writes that analysis can and should start in the field. So this incremental approach can be described as hypothesis generating rather than hypothesis testing. And as mentioned before, field research can have different sources for its research questions. In research-based and research-motivated projects, one would derive the research questions from existing research and literature and seek to overcome research deficits. In transformational research, on the other hand, one would collaborate with the research participants to decide which questions to ask. And it would then be their questions and their issues that you tackle in your research, and not necessarily the topics that are pointed out as areas to which further research is needed in the concluding chapters of translation studies research papers. This way, the logic of field research, especially transformational research, actually contradicts the logic of third-party research funding. Because in qualitative field research, the project proceeds depending on where and when you get access to your settings and what you find out there. But in research proposals, you need to explicate in beforehand what you want to study and why you want to study that, with which hypotheses, which methods of data acquisition and analysis, and with which impact and where you want to publish and when and so on. So including all these milestones and activities in a project management plan. And of course, this should be illustrated with a nice chart. So it's a dilemma, really. And in my research proposals, I try to choose a compromise. I give as much prior plans and promises as possible, but I point out explicitly that the method includes flexible adaptation to the circumstances in the field. Also, I trust that the funding agency in our research, it has been mainly the Austrian Science Fund, They will not complain if we do not exactly do what we planned and wrote down. If we are active and productive, if we can argue why we did what we did, and if we gather internationally interesting data and insights, and if we just publish and disseminate abundantly and are productive in that sense. Right, so let's discuss different data acquisition methods. I will start with this example of our RETREX project. So in this project, we set out to study what expertise means at the workplace for the social actors involved, and how these images of expertise manifest themselves in actions and work processes and organizational structures, maybe. So when we combine these questions with our socio-cognitive perspective, that of course has many methodological implications. Above all, they success this move from laboratory to field studies. It includes a shift from the ethic conceptualizations of scholars from the outside to the emic conceptualizations of those who work with translation. Or in the field of translation. So here we try to give participants a platform to express what they consider as expertise and who they consider as experts and why. So also the research does not have to be limited to translators. It can also include their managers, project managers, reviewers, cooperation partners, and other stakeholders or counterparts. It also implies an extension or a shift in the unit of analysis from texts and processes on a micro level to people and processes on a meso or macro level, and from individuals to collectives of some kind. And when we take all these considerations into account, one approach seems to be particularly suitable for research into lived expertise, in our case, namely the ethnographic perspective. And I think it's important to point out that ethnography is more than, it's more specific. It's more specific than just field research in general. It means being immersed in the chosen field and setting of study. So not all field studies are automatically ethnographic. Field studies can include qualitative or quantitative data analysis and sometimes rely strongly on theoretical propositions, whereas ethnographic research is always qualitative and it always lets the setting and the participants speak for themselves. The fundamental idea of ethnography is the highly experience-based attempt to acquire kind of the gut feeling of an insider. It attempts to reveal new factors and phenomena, and that way voice the unexpected and detect the counterintuitive. In translation studies, this allows the insider view of social actors working in the field of translations to be approximated as far as possible. Also, an ethnographic approach does not strive for generalization and representativity, but for a multifaceted, deep, and very close analysis of a single case or a few selected cases. And this requires intense engagement with the object of study, going into the field, and a willingness to learn from those who inhabit the culture, as Kaisa Koskinen writes. Ethnography is, of course, a research project that roots in cultural anthropology and aims to describe the way of life and thinking and culture and language of a specific group of people. There are a variety of translation studies, settings that could be investigated using an ethnographic approach. Prototypical translation cultures can be found at the workplace of professional translators, And much of the workplace research in translation studies is indeed ethnographically oriented. You see many examples here, studies on institutional translation, ergonomics of translation work, translation scholars and translators' contribution to translation studies, theater translation, freelance translation, work practices, emotions, creativity, project management, literary translation, the use of translation memories. Ethnographers originally studied the meanings, norms, and values of groups of people with languages and cultures that were unknown to the researchers, especially ethnic and marginalized groups. But today, this approach, ethnography, is broadly used in social sciences, also management studies, human-computer interaction, other fields interested in human action and social situations, including work ethnography, where you study the work organization and its impact on employers and employees. Also microethnography, where you use video recordings and analysis of the behavioral details of social actors in their environment. And of course, more and more virtual or online ethnography or netnography, these studying virtual and online communities and practices. For example, Regina Rogel used online ethnography or netnography as empirical method in her PhD thesis on this online amateur translation. And she combined field observation in the net interviews and artifact analysis. When it comes to the study of translation and cognition, cognitive ethnography can be seen as a particularly productive line of research. Traditional ethnography describes the ways of life and thinking and illustrates the diversity of human experience, whereas cognitive ethnography concentrates more strongly on life and thinking as processes. So Williams writes that cognitive ethnography looks at the moment-to-moment development of activity and its relations to sociocultural, often institutional processes unfolding on different time scales, unquote. So this way, cognitive ethnography extends ethnographic research in the direction of process-level analysis. What are the challenges of field research in general, including ethnographically oriented field research? Of course, gaining access to the field is a key issue in any field research and represents one of the main challenges for studying translators in context. There used to be a very strong consensus in observational research that it is necessary to seek formal permission to observe the subjects. But with the introduction of observations in digital spaces through virtual or online ethnography, it has, of course, become more difficult to ask all participants and the managers of these digital settings to sign a declaration of consent and a non-disclosure agreement prior to empirical inquiry. And that's something one has to tackle in those research projects. The decision of how to access the field and handle contact with the subjects depends also on the institutional ethical codes of the respective research institution and maybe relevant scientific associations. In some settings, of course, contacts are restricted by ethics committees or authorities, for example, in schools, in courtrooms, of course, in hospitals. So in the end, the decision will also come down to the personal ethical code of the researcher, as Pohl and Hilliard write. Any harmful effects of having been observed have to be avoided, especially when observing vulnerable subjects like marginalized groups or children. Trust is a major issue. The persons studied should be willing to participate anonymously and provide open access to their data. They should be willing to talk openly about the positive and negative aspects of their interactions with other actors and like clients, colleagues, superiors, and also talk about or show any frustrating experiences and conflicts maybe. Despite these challenges, our experience from prior studies shows that people are frequently willing to participate in observations, and they are willing to speak openly about their work if their anonymity is guaranteed and if trust in the researchers is sufficiently established. Trust building measures are therefore very important. Your personal skills, your diplomatic skills will be crucial in negotiating and obtaining and maintaining access to the field. So just to give you some advice on how you can proceed from our experience, try to provide information about the research project and its aims, just in general terms, very general terms, without scholarly terms or jargon. Show respect for the participants' work. You are the one who doesn't know, so that's why you are there. You are not evaluating them. Let them ask questions. Inform participants about the measures to protect their privacy. For example, the fact that you anonymize all personal and company information and that the raw data will only be accessible to the members of the research team or yourself if it's a project that you carry out alone. Also inform them about the possibility to withdraw their consent at any time. Give them something back if possible. For example, access to anonymized initial results, analyses, and allow them maybe the possibility to read and react to research reports that you publish or working papers. Of course, translators and interpreters might still be reluctant to let field research observe them in their workplace, which they could perceive as their protected space or for reasons of privacy or confidentiality, also, of course, competition and so on. Also, in institutional settings, access usually depends on gatekeepers, like managers, CEOs, who might facilitate or they might block access to the field. But still, obtaining permission to enter a field does not automatically mean that access has been gained to all the desired participants, to all the relevant data. I want to stress that access may need to be secured through gatekeepers, but it will also have to be negotiated and renegotiated with the people being studied. For our current RETRIX project, we actually needed 3 settings. That was our plan, and we had also described that in our funding application. So we wanted 3 settings, translation companies or departments, in which we can conduct several weeks of observations and where we can interview the observed. So last summer, we chose 4 agencies of different sizes in different cities to contact. And first, we had a moment of shock and horror as none of the translation agencies reacted immediately. And I knew that usually translation agencies are very quick in their reactions. It's part of their work. So I already saw us not being able to carry out the research project at all. And to be sure that that would not happen, I contacted another 2 settings, an agency and a translation department of a public service institution. And suddenly 5 of the altogether 6 settings sent us a positive reply, and only 1 of them rejected the request to participate. So now we had actually a new problem. I knew we would have trouble being able to spend weeks and weeks in 5 different offices, 5 departments, agencies, interviewing everybody, understanding how each of them works and thinks, and trying to get this insider view and how they act and why. That would be simply too much data for a 3-year project like RETREX with just 2 project researchers, additionally to my contribution. So at the end, as sad as it was almost good for us that the only 2 employees of one of the small translation agencies decided to change jobs. And the head of the agency, after all, decided to cancel their participation. So this is how we ended up with 4 wonderful cases and settings to study. So in the last months, the last 12 months about, we have now written huge amounts of field notes and protocols and diaries and reflections and analyses and summaries and whatnot. Also, even after having been granted access, challenging situations, of course, can occur. I'm sure many of you can report on that. Jelena Milosevic and I analyzed how we received and how we were received and perceived by the participants in our previous project, which was called CETRA, Extended Translation, and it was also funded by the Austrian Science Fund, FWF. Despite having presented our research and its aims to the participants and obtained formal consent for participation, some participants pulled out from the project. Some others had reservations which emerged only after data collection had already begun. So other study participants were just very forthcoming and welcoming, but not all. In the case of the 2 freelancers that we observed, one of them had taken part in a prior study of mine, and I knew that and she knew what she was getting herself into. She and her colleague were glad to participate in the study, and one of them actually expressed a doubt whether her, as she said, little translator life was interesting enough for a project like ours. But they were happy that they got this attention and were able to participate. This translation agency that we observed as a further case study had also participated in prior studies of mine, so they knew me and trusted me already, obviously. And both the management and the project management team were very open-minded about the participation. Case study number 3 was challenging. It was comprised of a technology company and the translation agency that they worked with. And the period of preliminary talks with the relevant department took quite a bit of time. The ultimate decision to participate in the study was made by the management solely. And in the process of the study, we noticed that some of the participants had obviously quite reluctantly accepted to be observed, and they rather wanted to tell us what they do and not be observed for longer periods of time. So also we started to analyze the reasons that led to their reservations. The technology company also gave us contact data of their 2 translation agencies, external agencies. So one of the agencies was very open-minded about participating in the study, and the second agency first agreed to participate, but then the management withdrew their acceptance because they were concerned about us gaining too much insight. There's too much could be revealed about maybe the current market situation that would increase competition. So they withdrew their participation. And the last one, case number 4 here, was the translation department in a public service institution. And here the translator team itself was very interested in participating, but as a huge institution, the final decision had to be made by all the levels of management. And at the end, we managed to get formal position from all the hierarchical levels, even up to the director of the whole national organization. So I have his signature in my office. Okay, so let's assume that you have got access to carry out field research in a concrete setting. There are several methods that can be used to collect data. The use of several data sources and methods can help cross-check the results and to contextualize the data. By applying a combination of these or similar methods, you can capture and interrelate different dimensions of translation work or translation processes. Observations will offer you insights into actual workplace praxis. Miller stresses the importance of not only hearing what people say, but also observing what they do, as this might be quite different. In participant observations, the observers are present and included in the observed situations. You are the instrument used in the observation, and they can communicate with the participants. So as soon as a researcher is physically present, even if only observing and listening, so in that kind of a passive observation, the observation becomes participant observation, as the researchers are visible to the participants. Researchers mostly do not participate in the setting in an active manner, at least not to the same extent as the research participants. For example, the observers do not carry responsibility for the translation work to be carried out. Their role is more peripheral, even though they might be actively involved in some tasks and interact with the participants. The case of autoethnography would be different because there you are the one acting and you reflect on your own actions systematically. But in observational research, ethnography, generally, that's not the usual case. Anyway, participant observation can give access to otherwise inaccessible areas of work, allow us to capture as many of the practices and experience as possible firsthand. So the observations focus primarily on the everyday working practices and interactions of the participants. And we kind of pay special attention to seemingly trivial and ordinary phenomena, because they reflect inherent preconceptions and social structures. Interviews allow you to interpret the views and rationalizations of the various social actors involved. The use of semi-structured and unstructured interviews gives the participants a voice and a platform to express their own perspectives. So in contrast to quantitative and experimental methods and more structured qualitative interview settings, these data collection methods actually shift the power from the researchers to the participants, as also Saldana and O'Brien describe in their methodological papers. Focus groups can allow opinions, beliefs, and experiences to emerge that might otherwise not be articulated. They are especially useful for exploring topics about which little is yet known. Group composition is, of course, important. It is usually recommended that the group be kept homogeneous to avoid conflicts and the repression of views. For example, when contextualizing translation expertise, for instance, separate focus groups can be conducted, for example, with translators, with translation project managers, different client groups, maybe CEOs of translation agencies, translation department heads, maybe also representatives of professional translator associations. So there are really many options there. Also, document analysis, if you want to combine observation with document analysis, it will give you insights into the rules and norms that guide their work potentially. If you analyze the company guidelines, for example, and also you can analyze the image that is mediated to the outside world if you analyze the website, for example. So you can collect documents and material that seems relevant for your research topic, also correspondence, internal guidelines, checklists, job adverts, and so on. And to manage all the data that you collect, you will need to make a data management plan in observational field research right in the beginning of your project, and to detail how you are going to document and archive the data and who has access to the data before empirical inquiry, during empirical inquiry, and also afterwards. So here you see how we record our observations and interviews and what kind of data we end up with. Or actually, this is only observations, not interviews, which we audio record. So in our current project, the RETREX project, we do not collect video or audio recordings in the field. Instead, we take this kind of field notes during observation. These examples stem from Raphael Sanholm and Antonia Baumann, and my field notes look exactly the same. Some of my colleagues and myself, we like to write field notes on paper, but others sit there with their laptops. We try to record as much as possible of all what we hear and see that is relevant for our research question. I have, of course, noticed that researchers with interpreter training and experience have some advantage in note-taking. So in any case, during note-taking, we often use abbreviations for foreseeable actions and other phenomena, tools maybe, that are relevant for our research questions. And I would recommend deciding on some of those abbreviations or signs in advance to facilitate noting them down. Letting the participants carry out their ordinary actions is an important way to minimize unwanted effects of observation. So it is supposed to maintain the naturalness of the situation. And I can confirm that with the passage of time, the researcher's presence will not be noted, and the participants simply go about their business. And as Anne-Christina writes, translators, translation project managers, people working in the field, they have tight deadlines to meet and they have heavy workloads to manage. So they really concentrate on their work and they have no time to put a show for the observer. It's important to transform field notes, the ones that you saw before, that we now note down during observation, to transform them into intelligible full sentences with all the context information immediately after observation. This step can also be carried out in different ways, using different tools depending on your preferences. Some of my colleagues sit down and translate kind of their field notes into full transcripts on the computer. I like to speak the full description on an audio recorder or my mobile phone first, and then I transcribe the full sentences into a neat transcript. And one of my colleagues, Antonia Baumann, she's also a speech-to-text interpreter, so she does it in a very individual way. She makes an audio recording of her field notes, I think, and later she re-speaks her own field notes, audio field notes, and lets the speak recognition software automatically write the transcript. So she only needs to do the necessary corrections to the transcript. Also, on each observation day, we carry field diaries, and the diaries explain the situation, reflect on the situation. They capture our own perspective on the observation. So this way, we ourselves, as the researchers, form really a part of the observed object. We reflect on our own reactions to what we have observed in these self-reflective diaries, and that helps us to manage and reduce observer bias, which is this observers' prejudiced interpretations due to subjective or theoretical preconceptions and prior knowledge. We anonymize confidential and sensitive data, for example, everything relating to persons, prices, clients, business processes, or we leave it out altogether in the documentation if it's not that relevant for the research question. Okay, for today, I'd like to give you 3 warnings to conclude my talk, my lecture today. Making a conscious effort to report observations in much detail as possible is essential. In qualitative research, you can set your planned strategies and predetermined categories aside in the beginning and shift your focus of attention as needed and enable new and unanticipated insights. However, of course, it makes sense to make the focus of your study very clear from the beginning, and then to remind yourself of this focus during the observations. In our extended translation, the first project, we wanted to catch the process of translation from a socio-cognitive perspective, and we ended up with many relevant factors and details on all the factors. So over several weeks of observation and interviews in altogether 6 different workplaces, in that case, we gathered a huge amount of data. And we managed to analyze it during the 3-year project. But most of the interpretation and publication activities, also talks, presentations in conferences, it happened afterwards, not during the project timeline. So this is why you should really keep the amount of data manageable. Choose quality over quantity. Also, 10 years ago, as field research on translation workplaces and ethnographies of translation were even rarer than today, I was often invited to speak and write about our experiences on using this kind of data acquisition method. So I was really happy to do that, one of my favorite topics. But this reduced our capacities to communicate on the results. So make a publication plan and reserve enough time for communicating on the results. And the third point here is it's typical for translation process and field research that it is a collective enterprise. It is frequently carried out by research groups, and empirical research of this kind often requires a team effort because you must involve in interdisciplinary input, in theory development, engage yourself in methodological innovation, carry out ample data collection, close analysis in every project. So for me, this kind of teamwork is really the best part of doing research. But it does include many challenges, especially when there are changes in the crew, in the research team. We manage them by having weekly meetings and a complete common documentation of every step that we do in a shared closed cloud. But still things can happen. For example, in our last project, one of us sometimes wrote her field notes in keywords and did not explicate and contextualize them in detail. That's why I maybe emphasized it that much before. When she left the project for a longer leave, we were not able to analyze and interpret some of those transcripts, which is a pity. So I would advise you to stick to an open and regular communication and information policy with the research team from project application to presentations and publications. If you do not work in a team, you will be happy to have all the information for potential later analysis of the data. And if you work in a team, just think that the project is your collective team effort, independent of the role of each team member. All your challenges, all your issues and problems, and all your successes and also achievements, they belong to all of you in equal parts. Right, and the next step during data collection and preparation is, of course, the analysis and interpretation of the data. But as mentioned, I will not talk about this qualitative data analysis and interpretation now, but I leave it for the 5th lecture, where I also report on our current research results. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Hanna, for a very valuable and workable, I think, insight into and also concrete examples of how to plan and structure and motivate collaborative qualitative field research, whether it's basic or applied or theoretical or and empirical, and also in a way that builds in flexibility. I think is important, immersion, and also how to deal with some very important challenges related to access, gaining and maintaining access, and the ethical considerations involved in this type of research. And you also covered how to collect different types of qualitative data. Interpretation will come later in your last lecture, but certainly managing that data is also part of the rich story you've told. So thank you very much. I think it was very insightful for a lot of us. And I see there's already some questions, so let's. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. Heidi, is that a question? Hand?
Yes.
Okay, please.
I have to let it go down. Okay. Thank you, Hanna. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk, which explained in a crystal clear way what are the issues and the challenges, but also what is about doing research in a passionate way, because that's what you need. I just want to frame 2 seconds my research to come to my question, because I'm an interpreting studies scholar, and I'm mainly into participatory action research with extremely vulnerable groups, meaning minors, prisoners, cult patients, culturally and linguistically different patients, and on top of that, non-professional interpreters. So that is a really complex agenda, let's say, and in all fields, legal, medical, and the community as a whole. You rightly talked about challenges of ethical clearance. We have huge data management plans to run, of course, to justify what we do with the data. And informed consents are part of it. And I'm now referring to my colleague, Anton Cox, with whom I'm working a lot, and also in a nice team on a project. He is an expert in reflecting on informed consents for these vulnerable groups. Do you have anything to say about that? Because you, as I noticed, you work mostly with professional interpreters. So how can we make informed consent accessible, intelligible for these vulnerable groups without having the ethical committees always coming back to us that we are not clear enough, reflecting GDPR rules, etc. But somebody who is illiterate or a minor who needs also consent from parents or anybody who is adult. How can you explain in simple words that they are free to take part in this research, that they are free to withdraw, that there will be no indication of their identity whatsoever? That's my main question and challenge that we are facing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I might actually switch the mode. So thank you very much. It's an extremely important and interesting question, because your challenges are even worse and bigger than mine. Actually, I have really only in our studies we have only observed and interviewed adults. It's not always professional people who have a background in translation studies and have studied translation, whatever, because that's not a criterion for us. We don't select translators for in the society. We work with them who translate, and it has been in professional settings. So it's a very selected setting, actually. And you mentioned many other settings where where people might be doing it just for fun, and others just because they happen to be in the situation, and minors and so on. So from my experience, we have tried to take care that our informed consent, that we have a written informed consent, that we have either per email or otherwise got the consent from our participants. What we also do, as our research is qualitative, and we really don't know what we will actually see, we don't specify that in very much detail, putting the exact research questions into such information. But we try to take care that they know what they are getting into, and the fact that we don't really know what. Often the motivation might be that we explain that we don't know what's happening in the translation field at the moment, because there's so much changing in such a high pace. So it's very understandable for them, and they often like participating also because they know we are at the university. We educate the next generation of translators. We have not been observing interpreters, but only translators and their clients and managers and so on. They would. We try to tone down their expectations on how we are going to use the results. We always stress that we simply want to know. This is our basic research, fundamental research. We don't know, and we want to know. And of course, if they want to stress that it's important for them to have that knowledge for the translation students, that they would get informed employees in the future, because of course we train their future employees. It makes sense that we also tell them that we need that insight into today's practice to talk about that in training.
Yeah. Okay. Now we are working and experimenting with animated videos as informed consents, but that's really tough to do, because we have these vulnerable groups who don't understand what a research question is. So,
Yes.
But we have to gain the trust, as you rightly told, and we have to be ethically clear, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And in the internet, online platforms, of course, Regina Rogel would be able to tell you more about that, because she had that ethical problem of not being able to have informed consent by everybody. But of course, still you can try to be as open as possible and inform people on it and so on.
Right. Thank you.
Your role.
Thank you very much.
It seems to me also that it's important. You mentioned, Hanna, that you had a case where, the participant agreed at the beginning, but halfway through data collection, they withdrew, and then you wrote about that process. You included that also in your results, these reservations towards participation at any phase in the study. And I think that's probably partially also for you, Heidi, relevant, like to also report on the challenges that you're facing, even in the first step of achieving informed consent from somebody who can't read, or a vulnerable person. So I think it's an important lesson.
Yeah, that's because we had this experience going to the hospital. Like our PhD student went like 100 times, and then had 7 approvals from doctor, patient, and interpreter. So because simply the informed consent was not readable, intelligible, it was too complex. So this is what we learned from an experience, from our experience.
I hope you report on that. I
Yeah.
think that will be relevant for all of us.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Just go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll spotlight you. From the students, perhaps? Anyone working in ethnographic research right now? Natalia? Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Well, I have a quick question that it is in some sort interrelated to different aspects that you treated here. So on the one hand, the first aspect is how much workplace is actually workplace, given like this period of COVID and confinement. So in the sense that if one is not able to get into the premises, but still you have like interviews to do, or I don't know, like the type of observation that is able, like it's possible to do from online spaces. So in my case, I said this because in my PhD research, I had interviews with international correspondents and journalists because I'm researching news translation. So I wasn't able to go to the actual premises, but several of them agreed for me to interview them. And then that is related to the second question. Since I wasn't able to observe as such, much of the data I collected from them became really their view, their life, their vulnerabilities, and so for me it was difficult to interpret that, knowing how vulnerable they are, because I couldn't rely on work, like field work as such observation, because it was everything they told me, and of course that puts them on the center and not the practices as such. It's what they report.
Yes, thank you so much. Very interesting topic, and something that many of us are struggling, because translation interpreting are such international fields and the networks are global. So how are you supposed to get an overview and insight into those networks? You can't travel all over the globe to all the workplaces, and there are people working from home. So actually in our RETREX project, we were supposed to start the project 1 year earlier, but I wrote an application to the funding agency to postpone the beginning in order to be able to really observe people in their workplaces, because I knew that this is going to be a bigger project. I will need to study people who I've never ever seen before. They have no contact to me, and I will need to build trust. So we postponed the beginning, and now we have been able to observe them at their actual offices. But many of them are working also at home. So you can think of whether you have established enough trust so that they will invite you to their homes. I have been observing also translators, freelance translators at their homes, and my colleagues. And other things happen there, of course, because the structure of the working day will, there are other structuring elements, of course, that suddenly make a difference, like dogs and children and washing machines and so on, and all the interaction with colleagues and so on might be only digital. So it shows a different working environment. So yes, also yes, as you mentioned, that people might not be working at their offices. We are working on collected volume, editing a collected volume on the topic of field research on translation and interpreting, and there are quite many examples there where people actually reflect on their methodological choices after having to change their data acquisition methods due to COVID, for example. So I know that some people have moved to video recording processes. So they just ask the translators to switch the video on when they start working. I also know that, for example, Waltraud Kolb was probably one of the first who observe literary translators at their workplaces. And they're, depending on what you're interested in, what kind of research questions you have, you might even ask them to use a screen recording program or keystroke logging program. Well, that of course it changes the process to some extent, maybe, but depending on your research questions, that might not be that such a big problem after all. So.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, that brings us to the end of our time together. So please join me in thanking Hanna Risku for yet another inspiring CETRA Chair lecture. We now have 30 minutes to have a break, and then we'll reconvene at 10:45 Brussels time for a Q&A with Professor Lieven de Hoost on his webinar on translation in history. So we'll see you all then, and thank you very much, Hanna.
Thank you.
Thank you.